Close your eyes. Imagine a silent mansion filled with millions of dollars worth of antiques. Priceless statues in every corner, centuries-old paintings on the walls. Now, listen to the absolute silence in this house until the maid finds the collector's lifeless body in the library that morning. That silence is what struck me first. It wasn't just quiet, it was a pressurized absence of sound, as if the house itself were holding its breath. My name is Detective Alistair Finch. My overcoat, still damp from the persistent October fog, felt heavy on my shoulders as I stepped over the threshold of Blackwood Manor. The fog hadn't just settled over the coastal road. It had seeped into the very bones of this place, clinging to the ivy-choked stone and blurring the edges of the world. A young uniformed officer, barely old enough to need a shave, met me in the grand foyer. His voice was hushed, reverent, as if we were in a cathedral rather than a crime scene. "This way, detective," he whispered, gesturing down a long hall. My footsteps on the marble floor were an intrusion, loud and graceless. The house was a monument to accumulation. Everywhere I looked, things stared back. Roman busts whose marble eyes seemed to follow me with cold indifference. Flemish tapestries that depicted grim, forgotten battles. Suits of armor stood sentinel at doorways, their metal gauntlets resting on the hilts of massive swords. This wasn't a home, it was a vault, a mausoleum for objects that had long outlived their owners, and now it had a new resident. We reached the library. The great oak doors were slightly ajar. The officer paused, his hand on the brass handle. "She's in the sitting room," he murmured. "The maid, Elena Vance, found him at 7 a.m. sharp when she came to draw the curtains. Hasn't said much since. The doctor gave her a sedative." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the sliver of darkness beyond the door. And the victim. Marcus Blackwood, 62, lifelong collector, never married, no children. As far as we can tell, he lived for, well, this. The officer gestured vaguely to the oppressive grandeur around us. I pushed the door open. The library was a cavern of dark mahogany and leather. Thousands of books, bound in reds and greens, formed a mosaic from floor to ceiling. A fireplace, wide enough to roast an ox, stood cold and black at the far end. And in the center, beneath a heavy crystal chandelier that hung like a silent spider, was the desk. Marcus Blackwood was slumped forward, his cheek resting on an open ledger. He was dressed in a quilted velvet smoking jacket, the color of dried blood. His silver hair was neatly combed. His eyes were closed. He might have been asleep, were it not for the unnatural stillness, the waxy pallor of his skin, and the faint, acrid smell of bitter almonds that hung in the air, just barely perceptible beneath the scent of old paper and beeswax. I walked slowly around the desk. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned chair, no scattered papers. A glass of what looked like brandy sat on a coaster, untouched. A heavy, ornate letter opener lay in its usual place. "Coroner's initial thought?" I asked the young officer, who lingered nervously by the door. "He's waiting for the full toxicology, sir," the officer replied, swallowing. "But the smell, he thinks it's cyanide, probably in the brandy decanter on the side table. We're bagging it now. Seems he didn't even take a sip from his glass." "He didn't need to," I murmured, studying the decanter. "It's volatile, just breathing it in, if the dose was high enough in an enclosed room." Blackwood hadn't just been killed. He had been suffocated by the very air in his private sanctuary. I turned my attention from the body to the room itself. Like the rest of the house, it was a curated world. Glass cabinets lined every wall that wasn't covered in books. They were filled with artifacts that made my stomach tighten. Jade figurines from the Ming dynasty, gold coins from the Byzantine Empire, intricate clockwork mechanisms from Renaissance-era Germany. Each item sat on its own velvet cushion, perfectly lit by small hidden bulbs. Each had a small, typewritten card describing its provenance. It was meticulous, obsessive. I moved along the cabinets, my gaze scanning the rows of priceless objects. My mind wasn't looking for a clue, it was trying to understand the man. What kind of person walls himself in with the ghosts of history? What was he afraid of outside these walls? And then I saw it. It was in the third cabinet, between a Persian astrolabe and a set of Fabergé nesting dolls. It was a simple, square, black velvet cushion, but unlike the others, it was empty. It wasn't just empty, it was waiting. A perfect, thumb-sized indentation was pressed into its center. There was no typewritten card, just a small, blank space where an object should have been. "Officer," I said, my voice quiet, "did forensics remove something from this spot?" The officer came closer, squinting. "No, detective, that's how we found it. We noted it in the log, an empty display. Figured the piece was being cleaned, or maybe he hadn't acquired it yet." I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. "This man," I said, more to myself than to him, "does not seem like the type to display an empty space. This whole house is about completion." I left the library and walked to the sitting room. It was brighter here, decorated in pale silks and delicate furniture that seemed absurdly fragile. Elena Vance sat on a chaise lounge, a thick wool blanket clutched around her thin shoulders. She was a woman in her late 50s, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide, and staring at a floral pattern on the carpet. I sat in the chair opposite her, keeping my voice low and soft. The rhythm of a slow, steady rain had begun to drum against the tall windows, a soothing, monotonous sound. "Mrs. Vance," I began, "my name is Detective Finch. I know this is a terrible shock. I only have 1 or 2 questions. Can you tell me about the library?" She flinched at the word, but nodded, her gray-blonde hair rustling against the blanket. I go in at 7 every morning to open the curtains to dust. He likes the dusting done before he wakes." Her voice trailed off, and she realized he would not be waking. "He was just as you saw him," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "He looked peaceful. I thought he'd fallen asleep at his desk. It's happened before. He works all night sometimes." "Mrs. Vance," I said gently, leaning forward, "in the 3rd display cabinet, there is an empty velvet cushion. Do you know what belongs there?" Her reaction was not what I expected. She didn't look confused. A small, strange frown creased her brow. "Oh," she said, her voice thin, it's just a toy." "A toy?" "Yes, a little soldier, a tin soldier." She looked at me, her eyes focusing for the first time. It was old, you see. Dented, the paint was almost all gone. It wasn't like his other things. It wasn't gold or jade. "A tin soldier," I repeated. "Why would he display it alongside these other, priceless items?" "It was the last one," she said, as if that explained everything. "He'd been hunting it for 30 years. It was part of a set," he said. "The Regiment of the Silent March, 12 soldiers. He had 11. This was the 12th, the drummer boy." She said he'd only acquired it last week. He'd been ecstatic, uncharacteristically so. He'd spent hours in the library just looking at it. "He called it," she whispered, "his final piece." He said, "Now, Elena, the collection is finally complete." I thanked her and left her to the care of the doctor. I walked back down the silent, watching hallway, the officer's footsteps echoing behind me. A house filled with treasures worth a king's ransom, a man poisoned in his locked study, and the only thing taken wasn't a Fabergé doll or a Ming vase. It was a worthless, dented tin soldier. I returned to the library. The body of Marcus Blackwood was being carefully removed by the coroner's men. Their movements were practiced and respectful, but still, they were a disturbance in the room's profound stillness. I stood before the 3rd cabinet, staring at the small, empty indentation on the black velvet. A complete set, the obsession of the collector. It wasn't about the monetary value, it was about the set, the completion, to have the final piece, the one he'd hunted for 3 decades, only to have it stolen. It was a violation far deeper than mere theft. It was a taunt. As the coroner's team zipped the bag, the sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet. I leaned in, my nose almost touching the glass of the cabinet. The young officer had been right. There was no dust, indicating the object had been there recently. But he had missed something. Just to the right of the velvet cushion, on the mahogany wood of the shelf itself, was a tiny, fresh scrape. It was almost invisible, a faint white line in the dark varnish. And resting in that scrape, so small I nearly missed it, was a single fleck of paint. It was not the dark red of the smoking jacket, nor the dark wood of the shelf. It was a bright, almost cheerful, royal blue, the kind of blue one would paint a child's toy. I looked at the empty space, and then at the door through which Blackwood's body had just passed. The rain lashed against the glass, a steady, rhythmic drumming like a distant march. Someone had killed Marcus Blackwood, not for his millions, not for his gold or his jade. They had killed him for his little tin soldier, and I had to find out why. The drive back to the precinct was a slow procession through a monochrome world. The October fog, thick as wet cotton, pressed against the windows of my sedan, blurring the opulent estates of the coastline into grey, indistinct spectres. The rhythmic thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers was the only sound, a metronome counting out the seconds, each one dragging me further from Blackwood Manor and deeper into the quiet absurdity of the case. My mind kept returning to that small, empty indentation in the velvet. A house overflowing with history's plunder, and the killer walks away with a child's plaything. It was long past midnight when I finally reached my office. The squad room was deserted, the air stale with the smell of cold coffee and typewriter ink. Only my desk lamp was on, casting a small, warm pool of amber light on the dark wood. The rest of the room was lost to shadow. Outside, the city was muted, the foghorns on the harbor sounding like distant, sighing beasts. I sat in my chair, the worn leather groaning in protest, and stared at the meager file I had started. Victim, Marcus Blackwood. Cause, pending toxicology, presumed cyanide inhalation. Motive, unknown. And then the only piece of physical evidence that truly mattered, a small plastic baggie. Inside it, barely visible, was the fleck of royal blue paint I had carefully lifted from the mahogany shelf. It was, as the maid had said, a toy soldier, the drummer boy, the 12th and final piece of the Regiment of the Silent March. This was not a robbery gone wrong. A thief, even a specialized art thief, would have taken the Fabergé dolls. They were smaller, more valuable, and infinitely easier to fence. This was not a crime of passion. The scene was cold, sterile, almost respectful. This was something else. It was a ritual. Blackwood had spent 30 years hunting this piece. He finds it. He completes his life's work, and within a week, he is dead and the piece is gone. The killer hadn't just taken an object. He had taken the victory. He had undone the completion. He had broken the set. I needed to understand the set. The next morning, the fog had receded, leaving behind a city that felt scoured and clean, the air crisp and cold. The sky was a high, pale gray. I left the precinct, not for the high-end auction houses or the sterile, climate-controlled vaults of the city's art appraisers, but for a part of town the map seemed to have forgotten. I drove to the old quarter, where the streets were still cobblestone, slick with dampness, and the buildings leaned against each other for support. Here, the shops sold things that had no practical use, dusty bookbinderies, shops filled with maritime brass, and emporiums for broken clocks. I was looking for one in particular, a name I'd found after 3 hours of digging through obscure collectors' forums in the early hours of the morning: the Old Toymaker. The shop was tucked into a narrow alley, its bow-fronted window so thick with grime it was nearly opaque. A small wooden sign, its gold lettering flaked and faded, swung on a rusty hinge, creaking softly in the damp breeze. I pushed open the door. A small bell tinkled, a cheerful sound that felt out of place in the dense, dusty silence that followed. The shop was a forest of forgotten childhoods. Marionettes, their strings tangled, hung from the low ceiling like peculiar fruit. Their painted smiles were unnerving in the dim light. Porcelain dolls stared from deep shelves, their glass eyes blank, their silk dresses faded to the color of ghosts. Model ships, their rigging intricate and broken, sat in dry dock on high shelves. And everywhere, soldiers, legions of them, lead, tin and wood. They stood in dusty dioramas, perpetually fighting silent, forgotten battles. "May I help you?" The voice was a dry rustle, like old parchment. I turned. Behind a counter piled high with cigar boxes full of marbles and stray doll limbs sat a man. He was ancient, thin as a bird, with a cascade of white hair and wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a sharp nose. He was polishing a small, brass locomotive engine with a soft cloth, his movements slow and deliberate. "I hope so," I said, my voice low. "My name is Detective Finch. I'm not here on official business precisely. I am assisting with an estate appraisal, a private matter." The old man, whose nameplate identified him as Elias Thorne, did not look up. "An appraisal? I do not appraise. I buy, I sell, I curate." "The estate is that of a collector," I continued, moving slowly towards the counter. "He had an extensive collection of toys, soldiers specifically." "Many people collect soldiers," Thorne murmured, breathing on the brass engine and polishing it again. "Mig not, Britons, they are common." "This set was not common," I said. "It was called the Regiment of the Silent March." Thorne's hand stopped. The cloth went still. For a long moment, the only sound in the shop was the slow, rhythmic tick-tock of a dozen asynchronous clocks on the wall behind him. He placed the engine down on the counter with deliberate care. He looked up at me, and his eyes, magnified by the thick lenses, were sharp and intensely curious. "You are not here for an appraisal, detective," he said, his voice no longer just a rustle. It was firm. "No one mentions that name by chance. Who is the collector?" I corrected softly, "Marcus Blackwood." Thorne nodded slowly, a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps sadness, passing over his face. Marcus? Yes, he was in here perhaps a month ago. He was agitated, excited. He said he was close. After 30 years, he was finally close. Close to what? I asked, though I already knew. "The drummer boy," Thorne whispered. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the marionettes hanging above him. "So he found it. He actually found it. I never thought he would. I warned him not to." "Warned him? It's a toy, Mr. Thorne." Thorne gave a short, dry laugh that sounded like stones rattling in a tin can. "A toy? Yes. So is a loaded pistol in the hands of a child. You do not understand what that set is, detective. It is not a toy. It is a story, a very dark one." He gestured for me to sit on a rickety stool opposite the counter. I sat. The dusty, quiet atmosphere of the shop was beginning to settle on me, the smell of old wood, glue, and metal. "It was crafted," Thorne began, lacing his thin fingers together on the counter, "in the 1870s, by a man named Bastien Leclerc. He was a toymaker in Strasbourg, a master. He made automata that could write, birds that could sing. He was a genius. But then the war, the Franco-Prussian War. Leclerc's two sons, both young, both musicians, were conscripted. They never came home. They were listed as lost in the siege. Leclerc," Thorne continued, his voice dropping, "went mad with grief. He locked himself in his workshop. He stopped making his beautiful automata. He began a new project, a final one, a regiment in memory of his lost boys, 12 soldiers." "The Regiment of the Silent March," I said. "Precisely. 11 soldiers, their faces grim, their rifles at their sides, and one lone drummer boy, his sticks raised but his drum silent. It was his ode to the silence his sons had left behind. He worked by candlelight for a solid year. The legend says he poured all his grief, all his rage, into the molding of the tin." Thorne leaned closer. The most unique thing was the paint. He mixed his own pigments. One in particular, a vibrant, deep blue for the uniforms. Leclerc's blue, they call it, brighter than any military uniform of the time, the blue of a perfect, clear sky, the blue of the eyes his sons had. He finished the 12th soldier, the drummer boy, and the story goes, the moment he laid down his brush, his eyesight failed him. He went completely blind. A shiver, unrelated to the damp cold, moved up my spine. I thought of the fleck of paint in my pocket, royal blue. "He died a few years later, in poverty and darkness," Thorne said, "and the set was sold, and that is when the other stories began." "What other stories?" "Misfortune, detective. The sets, he only made 3 were cursed. The first owner, a German baron, lost his fortune overnight. The second, an English lord, had his house burned to the ground. Everything was destroyed, except the 12 soldiers, found sitting in a perfect row in the ashes. The rumor was that Leclerc's grief was so potent it had infected them, that whoever owned the set would be plagued by a profound melancholy, a silence that would eventually swallow them." and that whoever tried to break the set, to separate the regiment. He didn't finish, he didn't need to. Who would want such a thing, I asked. Not collectors of toys, Thorne said, shaking his head. Collectors of stories, collectors of the macabre. The value of that drummer boy detective was not in the tin, it was in the completion of the legend. Blackwood had 11. For 30 years he was incomplete. Finding the 12th was finding peace. And someone took it from him, I murmured. Or, Thorne countered, his eyes sharp, someone else wanted that peace for themselves, someone who had also been hunting it. I leaned forward. Who, Mr. Thorne? Who else hunts a cursed legend? The old man hesitated. He looked around his shop, at the sleeping faces of the dolls, as if afraid they might be listening. There are only a handful, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It is a very small, very dark circle, but Blackwood, he had a rival, a shadow who trailed him at every auction, a man who believes these infected objects, as he calls them, hold a kind of power. They have been competing for the same dark artifacts for decades. What's his name? Thorne took a deep breath, the sound whistling in his thin chest. Sealer's Vein. The name Sealer's Vein settled in the quiet sedan with the weight of the lingering fog. It wasn't a name that evoked the sterile, high-gloss world of auction catalogs and velvet cushions. It felt older, dug from the earth. I left Elias Thorne's shop, the small bell over the door tinkling a faint metallic farewell. The dim alley felt colder, the damp air heavier. Thorne had given me a name, but it felt less like a clue and more like a second, darker story laid over the first. A story of curses, madness, and obsessive rivalries. The afternoon was spent in the municipal archives, a cavernous, cold room that smelled of acidic paper and dust motes. The rest of the precinct was chasing tangible crimes, stolen cars, bar fights, daylight robberies. I was hunting a ghost. Sealer's Vein was, as Thorne had suggested, a shadow. He paid his taxes, he owned property, but he did not exist in the newspapers nor in the society pages. Blackwood's life was a public record of acquisitions and galas. Vein was a study in silence. His address was not in the opulent hills by the coast. It was on the other side of the city, where the river bled into the industrial harbor, a place of forgotten warehouses and skeletal cranes standing silent against the gray sky. The fog was rolling back in as I drove, the evening light failing, turning the world to shades of blue and charcoal. The air grew thick with the smell of salt, cold metal, and the distant, mournful sigh of the foghorns. The address led me to a high brick wall, slick with grime and moisture. A single, heavy iron gate blocked the entrance to a wharf. There was no buzzer, no nameplate, only a small, tarnished brass plaque that read, Vein Imports. I parked the sedan, my headlights cutting 2 weak cones into the gloom. I walked to the gate. It was unlocked. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in a low, resonant protest that echoed in the damp air. The courtyard beyond was filled with shipping containers, stacked like mismatched blocks. There was no sign of life, only the rhythmic sound of water lapping against the massive stone pilings of the wharf. A single building stood at the far end, a massive brick warehouse, its windows dark and opaque, all except one. On the third and highest floor, a single, large arched window glowed with a dim, unsteady light, as if lit only by a fireplace. My footsteps on the wet cobblestones were the only sound. I found a steel door set into the brick. It, too, was unlocked. The air inside was shockingly cold, colder than the street. It was a vast, dark space, a cavern of shadows. My small flashlight beam swept across concrete floors and wooden crates, their contents stenciled with faded port of call markings from places like Shanghai, Alexandria, and Valparaiso. A heavy freight elevator stood in the corner, its iron cage open and waiting. I stepped inside and pulled the grate closed. The mechanism engaged with a low hydraulic hum, and the cage began its slow, grinding ascent. With each floor, the sounds of the city and the harbor faded, replaced by an intense, pressurized quiet. The kind of quiet I had felt in Blackwood's mansion, but this was different. Blackwood's silence was sterile, the silence of a vault. This was the silence of a tomb. The elevator shuddered to a stop. The grate slid open. The top floor was one enormous, open room. The ceiling was lost in shadows, supported by massive wooden beams. The only light came from the fireplace I had seen from outside, and from the vast arched window which framed the fog-shrouded harbor like a living painting. The space was filled with objects, but unlike Blackwood's meticulously curated displays, these were arranged with a kind of thematic, morbid artistry. There were no velvet cushions, no spotlights. On a pedestal sat a blackened, charred music box. Beside it, a framed newspaper clipping, "Orphanage Fire Claims 20. On the wall, a delicate porcelain teacup and saucer with a small card that read, "The Carlisle Estate, 1892. I recognized the name, a high society arsenic poisoning." He had the cup. In the center of the room, a man stood with his back to me, staring out the window at the black, swirling water. He was tall and unnervingly still. "Detective Finch," he said. His voice was smooth, melodic, and did not carry the slightest hint of surprise. It simply filled the space. "You are colder than usual. The damp gets into the bones out here. Please, come closer to the fire." He turned. Silas Vane was not the gnarled creature I had half expected. He was perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in a simple, dark wool suit. His face was sharp, intelligent, and pale. His eyes were a very light, clear gray, and they seemed to absorb all the dim light in the room. "You knew I was coming," I said. "It wasn't a question." "I knew someone would," Vane replied, gesturing to a leather armchair near the hearth. "When I heard of Marcus's theatrical exit, I knew the common police would be baffled. They would look for money or for passion. They would not know to look for the story. You, however, found Elias Thorne, and he, like all good storytellers, gave you the name of the villain." He smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Did I kill him, detective? Is that your question?" I remained standing, the dampness of my coat feeling heavy. "You were his rival. You both hunted the same objects. He found the drummer boy. Now he is dead, and the soldier is gone." "Rival?" Vane tilted his head, as if considering the word. "No, Marcus and I were opposites. Marcus collected things. He was a man of inventory. He wanted to possess, to catalog, to complete. He thought that by gathering all 12 pieces, he would win the game. He was a child lining up his toys." He walked slowly along his own collection, his hand ghosting over a rusted, barbed wire cross. "I, on the other hand, collect echoes, detective. I collect the grief, the madness, the despair that clings to an object. The story. Marcus wanted the drummer boy to fill a space on his shelf." He turned to face me, his pale eyes intense. "I wanted it for the wail of the toymaker who crafted it, for the blindness that struck him, for the curse that followed. Tell me, did you feel it in his house?" "Feel what?" "The silence, Leclerc's silence, the one that follows the regiment. It was there, wasn't it?" Blackwood had finally brought it home. "You haven't answered my question, Vane." "I did not kill Marcus Blackwood," Vane said simply. He walked over to a small table and poured brandy into 2 glasses. "And I do not have the soldier." He offered me a glass. I declined. The smell of bitter almonds was still too fresh in my memory. Vane chuckled softly. "Prudent, but unnecessary. I assure you my methods are far more subtle. Why would I kill him? His death has complicated things. He was the only other person who understood the hunt. His death in a locked room surrounded by his treasures. It's clumsy, it's final. I much prefer the game." "If you don't have the soldier," I said, "then who does, and why?" Vane took a slow sip of his brandy, staring into the fire. The flames cast dancing, orange highlights on his pale face. "That," he murmured, "is the question that truly matters. Someone else has entered the game, someone who is not a collector, someone who does not understand the rules." He looked at me, or perhaps someone who understands them far too well. "You see, Marcus made a mistake. He assumed the drummer boy was the end of the collection, the final piece, a trophy, but he was wrong." I waited. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the low, distant moan of a foghorn. "It wasn't the end, detective," Vane whispered. "It was the key. The curse of the silent march, the legend Thorne was so quick to tell you. It only manifests when the regiment is complete. The melancholy, the misfortune, the silence, it requires all 12. For 30 years, Blackwood was safe because he was incomplete. By finding the drummer boy, he didn't just finish his collection, he armed it. A cold realization settled over me, heavier than the fog. He was poisoned, the air in the room. Leclerc's sons were suffocated in the siege, Vane said, his voice a near whisper. The legend says the curse suffocates. It steals the air from the room. A poetic, if unfortunate, end. Someone, or something, was waiting for that final piece to be put in place. You're talking about a ghost story, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Am I? Vane smiled. You are here, detective, in a cold, dark warehouse, hunting a tin toy, because a man was killed in a way that defies simple explanation. We are long past ghost stories. I turned to leave, my mind reeling. Vane's labyrinth of logic was a fog all its own, and I needed the cold, clear air. I needed a hard fact. Vane, I said, my hand on the elevator grate. If you're not the killer, why tell me this? Why help me? He stood by the window, a dark silhouette against the muted glow of the harbor. Because the game is ruined, a masterpiece has been stolen, not for its story, but for some crude, unknown purpose. The silence has been released, and I am intensely curious to see who holds the leash. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Be careful, detective, Vane said, his voice soft, but carrying across the vast room. Blackwood collected things, I collect echoes. The drummer boy is a very loud echo, but it's not the only one in that house. You've been so focused on the one that was taken. Did you check the other 11? The slow, grinding descent of the freight elevator was a journey back to a world I no longer fully recognized. Vane's words, "Did you check the other 11?" had lodged in my mind like a shard of glass. They were a splinter of doubt, a subtle poison that worked its way through all my previous assumptions. I stepped out of the warehouse, back into the harbor's damp embrace. The fog was a living thing, a cold, gray presence that swallowed the sound of my footsteps on the cobblestones. The drive away from Vane Imports was automatic. My hands knew the motions, but my mind was miles away, back in the silent library of Marcus Blackwood. I had been so focused on the absence, the empty velvet cushion, the stolen final piece. It was the natural inclination of a detective to look at what was missing. But Vane, the collector of echoes, looked at what remained. It was well past 2 a.m., but I didn't drive home. I didn't go to the precinct. I turned the sedan's nose back toward the coast, back toward the opulent, silent estates veiled in mist. I drove back to Blackwood Manor. The house was a mountain of shadow, a silhouette against the lesser dark of the fog-shrouded sky. The uniformed officer who had been posted at the drive was gone, replaced by a single, bored-looking patrol car parked near the main gate, its occupants likely asleep. I used my badge to get past him, my headlights sweeping across the imposing facade as I drove up the gravel path. Letting myself in with the crime scene key felt like a transgression. The house was even quieter than before. The pressurized silence had deepened, settled. The air was cold, still carrying the faint, chemical ghost of cyanide, a scent my mind may have been inventing. My flashlight beam, now my only companion, cut a nervous circle in the grand foyer. The marble eyes of the Roman busts seemed to watch me with a new, knowing coldness. The suits of armor were not just sentinels, they were witnesses, standing guard over a secret. I walked the long hall, my footsteps an obscene intrusion. Thwack, 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 the sound of my own shoes on the marble. The library was sealed. A strip of yellow police tape was stretched across the great oak doors. I ducked under it and stepped inside. The room was as I had left it, but the coroner's visit had left its mark. A fine dusting of fingerprint powder covered the desk. The open ledger had been bagged and taken. The brandy decanter was gone. The room felt violated, its sterile perfection disturbed. My flashlight beam found the third cabinet. The empty cushion, with its single, thumb-sized indentation, seemed to mock me. It was the epicenter of the crime. I turned away from it. My light scanned the other cabinets, the ones I had only glanced at before. The jade figurines, the Byzantine coins, And then, in a tall, narrow cabinet near the cold fireplace, I found them. The other 11. The Regiment of the Silent March. They stood in a perfect row, just as Thorne had described. 11 tin soldiers, each about 3 inches high. They were not at attention. Their rifles were held at their sides, their heads slightly bowed, their faces cast in a uniform expression of grim, perpetual sorrow. They were marching, as the name suggested, but in a funereal procession. And their uniforms, Thorne was right. They were painted in a blue so vibrant, so deep, it seemed to drink the light from my flashlight. It was a lapis lazuli, an impossible clear sky blue, Leclerc's blue. It was beautiful, and in the dark, dusty library, it felt shockingly alive. I studied them one by one, the rifleman, the standard bearer, the captain. Each one was a small, perfect sculpture of grief. The craftsmanship was heartbreaking. I moved the beam of light down the line from the first soldier to the second, the third, the fourth. My hands stopped. I leaned in, my face so close to the glass, I could feel the cold of it on my skin. The fourth soldier. It was almost identical. The same pose, the same rifle, the same downturned, sorrowful face, but the blue. It was wrong. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible difference. A difference only a true collector, someone who had studied the legend, would ever notice. It wasn't Leclerc's blue. It was a standard, common navy pigment. It was dull. It was flat. It had none of the life, none of the impossible depth of the others. It was a forgery, a very, very good one, but a forgery nonetheless. My breath fogged the glass. The implications hit me, one after another, in the cold, silent library. Blackwood's set was not complete. It had never been complete. He had acquired the drummer boy, the final 12th piece, but his 11th piece was a fake. He had been duped, perhaps years ago. This changed everything. Vane's theory of the curse of the armed and completed set was wrong. The set was never armed. The silence had never been released, which meant the poisoning, the cyanide in the air, was not the work of a phantom. It was the work of a human hand, a deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly knowledgeable human hand. But why, if the set wasn't complete, why kill Blackwood now? I stared at the fake soldier. The killer takes the real drummer boy. Why? And then a new, colder thought emerged. What if the killer knew the 4th soldier was a fake? Blackwood finds the real 12th piece. He believes his life's work is done, but the killer knows it isn't. The killer knows the true 11th piece is still out there somewhere. By killing Blackwood and stealing the drummer boy, the killer hasn't just broken the set. They have frozen it. They have created an impasse. With Blackwood dead and the 12th piece gone, the true set of 12 can now never be assembled by anyone. This wasn't a crime of greed. It wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't even about a curse. It was about preservation. It was about stopping the game forever. Who would have such intimate knowledge? Who would know about the forgery? Who would care enough to kill just to stop the collection from ever being truly finished? Not Vane. Vane lived for the game. This act was the antithesis of his entire philosophy. My mind went back to the first day, to the pale, shocked woman clutching a blanket in the sitting room. It's just a toy, a little soldier. He'd been hunting it for 30 years. He called it his final piece. Elena Vance, the maid, the one who found him. I left the library, pulling the yellow tape back into place, my mind racing. She wasn't just a servant who dusted the shelves. She knew the name of the regiment. She knew the 30-year hunt. She knew his exact words. She was no longer at the manor. The young officer at the gate had told me she'd been moved to a small gardener's cottage at the edge of the estate, away from the scene. I walked, not drove, down the gravel path. The fog was thinner here, the air smelling of pine needles and damp earth. A small cottage, dark and silent, was nestled under a canopy of ancient, dripping trees. A single light was on, in a downstairs window. I knocked. The sound was flat, absorbed by the damp wood. I heard movement inside, a long pause, then the sound of a bolt being drawn. The door opened a crack. Elena Vance peered out. She was not the sedated, shocked woman from 2 days ago. Her eyes were red-rimmed but clear and wary. She was dressed in a simple coat, and behind her on the floor, I could see 2 suitcases, packed and closed. "Detective Finch," she said, her voice a low, nervous whisper. "What is it? It's the middle of the night." "You're leaving, Mrs. Vance?" I asked, my voice just as low. I can't stay here," she stammered, pulling her thin housecoat tighter. "The estate, his lawyers, they said I should. It's all too much." "I have one more question about the soldiers, the other 11. She froze. Her hand, which had been clutching the door, went still. "What about them? I told you, I just dusted." "The blue paint," I said, watching her face. It was a shot in the absolute dark, based on nothing but Vane's strange riddle and a fleck of pigment. The color, Leclerc's blue. Her reaction was not a gasp. It was not a denial. It was a sudden, sharp intake of breath. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but in a kind of profound, terrified recognition. She stared at me as if I had spoken the name of a ghost. Her knuckles, gripping the door, turned white. "How?" she whispered, her voice trembling, all pretense of the simple maid dissolving in that one word. "How did you know that name?" Only Mr. Blackwood called it that." The small, damp room seemed to shrink around us. The single, bare bulb overhead cast harsh yellow light, making the shadows in the corners of the room deep and black. Outside, the fog pressed against the window panes, 1,000 ghostly faces trying to peer in. The only sound was the slow, steady drip, drip, drip of water from the ancient pines onto the cottage roof. Elena Vance stood in the doorway, her hand frozen on the wood. The question, "How did you know that name?" hung in the air, an admission so total it left no room for denial. I stepped past her into the room and quietly pushed the door closed, shutting out the cold, damp night. The air inside was thick with the smell of old tea, dust, and a faint, floral scent of lavender soap. Her 2 suitcases sat by the small, unlit fireplace like patient, waiting hounds. "Only Mr. Blackwood called it that," I repeated softly, not as a question, but as a statement. "Because you told him the name, because you knew the story, not the collector's story, Mr. Thorne's story, the real one, the toymaker's." She didn't move. The fear that had made her tremble was gone, replaced by a profound, unnerving stillness. It was the stillness of the library, the stillness of the armor in the hall. It was the stillness of a decision made long ago. "Sit down, Elena," I said. My voice was gentle. This was not an interrogation. It was a confession, one that had been waiting, perhaps for decades, to be heard. She moved slowly, mechanically, and sat on the edge of a narrow cot. Her hands, red and chapped from work, were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. "My full name," she began, her voice a low monotone barely audible above the dripping rain, "is Elena Vance, Leclerc." I felt the last piece of the puzzle slide into place, the cold, smooth click of finality. "Bastian Leclerc," I whispered, "the toymaker." "My great-great-grandfather," she said. She looked up, and her eyes, which I had thought were simply wide with shock, were now filled with a burden so old it was bottomless. "He did not just leave behind a curse, detective. He left behind a duty passed down from mother to daughter. We are the keepers, the watchers. We are charged with ensuring the regiment of the Silent March is never, ever assembled." The air in the room felt heavy, hard to breathe. I thought of the cyanide. "The legend is true," she continued, her voice gaining a strange, fragile strength. "The grief he poured into them, it is not a story, it is real. My grandmother told me of the fire in England. My mother knew the German baron's family. We have tracked the pieces. We have watched as they ruin lives, not with a sudden bang, but with a slow, creeping silence, a melancholy that drains the soul." "You came to work for Blackwood," I stated. 20 years ago," she nodded. "He was the most aggressive, the most obsessed. He had acquired 6 of the soldiers, more than anyone else in a century. I knew I had to be close to him, to watch, to intervene if I had to." "The 4th soldier," I said, "the fake, that was you." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "He was getting close to finding the real one 15 years ago. I commissioned a copy, a very good one. I arranged for a dealer to sell it to him. It was a terrible risk, but it worked. He was fooled. He placed it in his cabinet, and for 15 years the hunt slowed. He was happy, but he was incomplete, and the world was safe. She looked at her packed bags. I thought my watch was almost over. He was an old man. He would die, his collection would be broken up, and the pieces would be scattered again. The danger would pass. But then, I said, he found the drummer boy. Yes, she whispered, the 12th piece. He was ecstatic. He called it his final victory. He spent all night in the library just looking at them, and I was relieved because I knew he had 12 pieces, yes, but one was a fake. The set was still dormant. He was happy, he was wrong, and he was safe. I sat in the single wooden chair opposite her. The small room was a pocket of impossible, old-world secrets, existing just yards from a modern, unsolved murder. What changed, Elena? He was safe. The set was dormant. Why kill him? She looked down at her hands. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint rustle of her coat as she took a shaky breath. He didn't just look at them, she said, her voice cracking for the first time. He studied them. His victory made him meticulous. The night before he died, he called me into the library. He was not ecstatic. He was cold. His face was white with a rage I had never seen. She looked up at me, her eyes mirroring the scene. He found it, she whispered. After 15 years, he found the flaw, the paint. He told me. He said, the blue is wrong, Elena. It's wrong. I've been played for a fool. He knew, I murmured. He knew, she confirmed. But that wasn't why he had already been searching. He said, finding the drummer boy opened the final door. I have found the real 4th soldier. It's on its way. It will be here tomorrow. The confession landed in the small, silent room. The drip, drip, drip from the roof seemed to grow louder, counting down the last seconds of Blackwood's life. He had been on the verge. He had the 12th piece, and he was about to acquire the real 4th piece. He would have all 12. He would, after a lifetime of hunting, finally, terribly, complete the set. I pleaded with him, she said, tears now tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. I told him the legend. I told him who I was. I begged him, for his own soul, to stop, to let it go. And what did he say? He laughed. He called me a superstitious old woman. He said, that's the whole point, my dear. I want to see if the legend is true. I want to feel it. I want to own the curse itself. That is the final acquisition. Her face hardened. The sadness was gone, replaced by the grim, ancestral resolve. He would not be stopped. He was going to doom himself, and for what? For a thing, for a piece of painted tin. He was going to unleash my ancestors' grief just to see what would happen. So you stopped him, I said. It was not an accusation. It was a benediction. I had to, she whispered. I could not let him complete the set. I could not let him win. The cyanide. I have known how I would do it for 20 years, if it came to this. I read Bastian's journals, the legend, the silence suffocates. It was the only way. I had to seal the legend. I had to make it real. I had to kill him in a way that looked like the curse, to warn off any others, to warn off Sealer's vein, to make the regiment so terrifying that no one would ever hunt it again. She had used his own obsession against him, turning his collection into a crime scene that was, itself, a piece of dark, curated art. The morning he was to receive the final soldier, she said, her voice flat, I put the cyanide in the brandy decanter. I knew he never drank, he just liked the smell. I knew it would be volatile. I knew the air in that sealed room. It would be a kindness. He would fall asleep. He would not feel it. He would be silent. And the soldiers, I said, my gaze moving to the packed suitcases. You stole the drummer boy to break the set, to create the mystery. Yes, I took it from the cabinet. After, she gestured to the larger of the 2 bags, and the other one, the real one, the postman delivered it that morning just as I was calling the police. I signed for the package. I told no one. I had to take them both. I had to keep them safe, keep them separate. She stopped speaking. The confession was over. The small cottage was profoundly silent, holding the truth of a century and a half of pain. She rose from the cot, her movements slow, as if she were underwater. She walked to the larger suitcase and unclipped the brass latches. They snapped open with a sound that was unnaturally loud. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of old, faded yellow silk, lay two small, tin figures. On the left, the drummer boy. His sticks were raised, his face was a mask of sorrow, and his uniform was a shocking, vibrant, impossible royal blue. On the right, another soldier, a rifleman. His head was bowed, and his uniform was painted in the exact same, living, heartbreaking shade. Leclerc's blue. The real fourth soldier. The key and the lock lying side by side, the two pieces that could never, ever be allowed to meet the other 10. I stared at them, the solution to a murder, the heart of a legend, the entire heavy weight of a family's grief, all resting in a worn-out suitcase. "What will you do now, Detective?" Elena Vance Leclerc asked. She was not afraid, she was just tired. Her watch was over. The burden was, at last, being passed. I looked from the soldiers to her face. I thought of Blackwood, dead from his own suffocating greed. I thought of Vane, in his dark warehouse, playing with echoes. I thought of these two small, potent figures. "Close the bag, Elena," I said, my voice hoarse. This was not a murder, this was an ending. Elena's hand, no longer trembling, moved to the lid of the suitcase. She slowly, deliberately, folded the yellowed silk back over the two tin figures, shrouding them in darkness. The brass latches clicked shut, one after the other. The sound was finite. It was the sound of a coffin being sealed. She looked at me, her face pale in the stark yellow light, her eyes holding the exhaustion of generations. "What will you do, Detective?" she asked again, but the question was different now. It was not the plea of a suspect, but the query of a partner at the end of a long and terrible task. I stood there in that small, damp room, a man of law, of facts, of reports typed in triplicate. My entire career was built on a simple equation. A crime leads to a clue to a culprit to a cell. But this was not an equation, it was a poem. It was a dark, century-old story that had refused to end. Marcus Blackwood, I said, my voice quiet, testing the weight of the words, was a man consumed by his obsession. He was known for his eccentricities. He was known for his theatricality. I was no longer speaking to her. I was formulating the report in my head, the official story, the new legend that would replace the old one. He was on the verge of completing his life's work. I continued, my gaze distant, fixed on the fogged-up window. He was known to be fascinated by the curse of his collection. He spoke of it often. He acquired a chemical, cyanide, perhaps to clean his artifacts, perhaps to test the legend himself. A foolish, arrogant act. He staged his own death scene, a final, morbid piece of theater for his collection. I looked at her. He inhaled the fumes accidentally, a tragic, self-inflicted end. Case closed. Elena stared at me, her lips parted. She understood. I was not just letting her go. I was burying the truth with her. I was taking the burden from her shoulders and placing it onto my own. "And the soldier," she whispered, "the drummer boy, the police, they know it's missing." "A simple theft," I said, "unrelated, occurred in the confusion after the body was discovered, perhaps by a first responder, a servant. It's a worthless piece of tin. The insurance company will write it off. The case will go cold." The silence that followed was different. The pressurized quiet of the manor, the heavy, tomb-like silence of Vane's warehouse, the ancestral silence of Elena's secret, it was all gone. This was just quiet. The drip, drip, drip of the rain on the roof had slowed, the storm having finally passed. "You must go," I said. "Where?" she asked, not in confusion, but as if needing a final order. "Somewhere without ghosts," I replied. "Somewhere the name Leclerc means nothing. Somewhere you can just be Elena." She nodded slowly. A single, final tear rolled down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of fear. It was a tear of release. The watch, passed down through 5 generations, was finally, truly over. She picked up her 2 small suitcases. The larger one, I knew, felt heavier than its size would suggest. "And them?" she asked, her chin tilting toward the bag. "I cannot keep them, I cannot sell them, I cannot destroy them. The fire, my grandmother said the fire didn't work, they just remained." "No," I said, "the fire didn't work, but water will." I thought of the deep, cold, black water of the harbor, the place where Vane watched the fog. Water scatters, water forgets, fire only hardens. I opened the door. The fog was beginning to thin, the air sharp and cold. The first, faint, bruised purple hint of dawn was touching the eastern sky, separating it from the blackness of the sea. We did not speak. I walked beside her down the gravel path, past the great, dark manor house whose master lay in a cold city morgue, a victim of his own story. I walked past my sedan. We walked all the way to the great stone cliffs that overlooked the ocean, not far from the estate. The fog was still thick over the water, a rolling, white blanket that muffled the sound of the waves crashing far below. It was a place where the world simply ended. Elena set the suitcase down on the damp grass. She opened it one last time. She did not look at me. She looked down at the two small figures, her face illuminated by the growing, weak light of the morning. "Goodbye, Bastian," she whispered. Her hand, chapped and strong, reached in and took the drummer boy. She held it for a long moment, then drew her arm back and threw it, with all her strength, out into the white, empty void. We heard no splash. It was just gone. Then she picked up the other, the rifleman, the true fourth, the linchpin. She threw it in the same direction. She closed the empty suitcase. She turned to me. "It is done," she said. It was the first time I had ever seen her face free of the burden. She looked simple, just a woman in her late 50s, in a worn coat on a cold morning. "Go to the station," I said. "Take the first train heading south. Don't look back." She nodded. She picked up her bags and began to walk away, not toward the cottage, but toward the main road. I watched her until her small, upright figure was swallowed by the last remnants of the coastal fog. I stood alone on the cliff for a long time, listening to the invisible ocean. The case was closed. The law had been broken, but a kind of profound, deep justice had been served. I drove back to the city as the sun rose, a weak, watery disk of pale gold. The fog dissolved, and the world returned, sharp and clear, in all its mundane reality. I filed the report, accidental death by misadventure. The captain read it, grunted, and signed off, eager to be rid of a case that had no clean lines. I never saw Silas Vane again. I sometimes wondered if he waited in his dark warehouse, watching the harbor, still hunting for the echoes of a story I had just erased. I wondered if Elias Thorne, in his dusty shop, sensed that the regiment was, at last, truly silent. I went back to my desk, to the new files, the new cases, the stolen cars, the bar fights, the daylight robberies. But sometimes, late at night, when the squad room is empty and the only sound is the rain against the glass, I think of that small, empty indentation in the velvet. I think of the impossible, vibrant blue of a toymaker's grief. And I find myself listening to the silence, not for a clue, not for a sound, but for the profound, peaceful quiet of an ending, the quiet of a story that has, at long last, been put to rest.